Ladies and gentlemen, there's a silence that settles over the world when night falls. The streets grow quiet, the noise dies down, and people retreat to the comfort of their dreams. But while the world sleeps, champions rise, innovators rise. When we talk about rising while the world sleeps, we're not just discussing waking up early or grinding while others rest. No, it's far deeper than that. We're talking about sacrifice, conscious, chosen, sometimes painful sacrifice. And that's a concept many people avoid because it demands something of us. It suggests that comfort is not always our ally and that the pursuit of ease might very well be the greatest obstacle to meaning. You see, success, real success, is not some moment of glory or applause. It is the residue of disciplined, often invisible sacrifice. It is carved out in solitude, in struggle, in the refusal to give up when quitting is the easiest option on the table. Now think about this. Life is inherently difficult. It's filled with suffering, loss, unpredictability, and chaos. And if you're not actively building yourself into someone who can carry the weight of all that, then life doesn't just feel meaningless, it becomes unbearable. That's where sacrifice becomes not only important, but necessary. Because what is sacrifice really? It's the voluntary postponement of gratification. It's giving up what you want now for what you want most. That's not a punishment. That's maturity. And it's precisely what distinguishes someone who becomes exceptional from someone who remains average. Let me tell you something uncomfortable. Most people don't want to rise while the world sleeps because rising costs something. Rising means saying no to distractions, to laziness, to the dopamine-driven quick fixes that have replaced effort in our culture. It means standing in the tension between who you are and who you could be, and then doing the work necessary to bridge that gap. You want to be stronger, then you have to bear more. You want to be wiser, then you have to confront truth. You want to be exceptional, then you must endure what most people are unwilling to face. Here's the mistake so many people make. They think the pain of effort is worse than the pain of regret. But the pain of regret, that's permanent. That follows you. That eats at you when the world quiets down and you're left alone with your thoughts. Effort, on the other hand, is temporary. It stings in the moment, sure, but it shapes you. And the more you endure it, the more capable you become of carrying heavier burdens. This is how you become someone who can face the uncertainty of life without crumbling. And let's be honest, you already know when you're not living up to your potential. You feel it. There's a quiet shame that creeps in when you've wasted time, when you've taken shortcuts, when you've said I'll do it tomorrow for the 10th time in a row. That's your conscience. It's telling you you could be more, and it won't stop whispering that just because you try to ignore it. In fact, the more you ignore it, the louder it eventually gets, until it's screaming at you in the form of anxiety, depression, self-doubt. That's not just a mental health issue, it's an existential crisis. It's your soul reminding you that the path of least resistance is killing you slowly. So rise, not just in the literal sense, but in the moral and spiritual sense. Rise above the mediocrity you've allowed to take root. Rise above the laziness you've justified. Rise above the excuses you've been feeding yourself. And work not just for success, but for competence, for resilience, for the capacity to stand upright in a world that is constantly trying to make you bend. When the world sleeps, it's not just about time zones and clocks. It's about the collective unconsciousness of a society that has become numb to purpose. So few people are awake in the real sense of the word. They're sleepwalking through their lives, sedated by distraction, pacified by comfort. But if you can be one of the few who wakes up not just from sleep, but from slumbering existence, then you will be dangerous in the best possible way. You'll be someone who cannot be ignored, someone who does not wait for permission, someone who builds while others dream. And that's not an ego trip, that's your responsibility. Because if you can bear more, you must bear more. If you can do more, you must do more. The world doesn't need more followers of trend. It needs builders, thinkers, leaders, people who can rise in the dark and lay foundations while everyone else is still hoping for daylight. This is not just about ambition, it's about meaning. When you choose to sacrifice your comfort to become something more, something refined by fire, you are stepping into the deepest level of human experience. You're not just surviving, you're transcending. You are no longer reacting to life. You are responding to a higher calling. And that's where you'll find meaning, not in pleasure, but in purpose. Not in having, but in becoming. Now, is that easy? No, absolutely not. It is brutal, but easy was never the goal. Easy is for those who aim low enough to hit mediocrity every time. You don't want easy, you want worthy. You want difficult, because difficult has depth. Difficult demands that you rise. Difficult is where the glory lives. So when the world sleeps, and you feel that tug to rest with them, to drift, to delay, to numb, remember what's at stake: your potential, your future, your integrity. Sacrifice now for the strength you'll need later. Because there will come a day when the storm hits your life, and when it does, you'll either have the foundation to withstand it, or you won't. And you don't build that kind of strength during the storm. You build it before, quietly, relentlessly, when no one is watching, when everyone else is asleep. If you want to rise while the world sleeps, then you must learn to master one thing above all else: discipline. Not the kind that comes from outside, rules imposed by authority, schedules made by others, but the kind that is born within you, forged through suffering and deliberate struggle. Because discipline, in its purest form, is the voluntary acceptance of responsibility. It's the decision to do what must be done, even when no one is watching, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's hard. You see, we live in a world addicted to distraction, and it's not accidental, it's engineered. You carry in your pocket a device that offers an infinite stream of attention traps, each one more seductive and more meaningless than the last. Notifications, entertainment, algorithms tuned precisely to your weaknesses. That's not just a design flaw, that's a spiritual battlefield. And most people are losing. Every time you choose distraction over discipline, you are training yourself to become weaker. You're practicing avoidance. And what you avoid doesn't go away. It grows. It festers. It waits in the shadows of your life, becoming heavier each time you refuse to confront it. So what's the solution? You develop discipline by choosing order over chaos, structure over spontaneity, effort over ease. And this choice, this daily act of defiance against your lower impulses, this is where character is built. This is where potential becomes transformation. And it's not glamorous, it's not cinematic, it's repetitive, it's frustrating, and it's lonely. That's why so few people do it. Because to be disciplined is to reject comfort when comfort is everywhere. It's to resist distraction when distraction is the default. People talk about freedom as if it means doing whatever you want, whenever you want. That's not freedom, that's chaos disguised as liberty. Real freedom comes from self-mastery. If you are not the master of your own habits, your own attention, your own appetites, then you are a slave to them. And slaves don't rise while the world sleeps. Slaves wait. Slaves consume. Slaves obey whatever noise is loudest. But a free person, one who has earned their freedom through discipline, they choose their path. They walk into the storm while others hide from the wind. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of your life have you handed over to discipline? How many hours, days, years have you traded for nothing? No meaning, no depth, no purpose, just passing time. The tragedy of our time isn't that people lack opportunity, it's that people are squandering the time and attention that could lead them toward greatness, not out of laziness, but because they've never truly been taught that discipline is not repression, it is liberation. To discipline yourself is to declare that your life is not for wasting, that your mind is not for renting out to the highest bidder, that your soul is not for sale. And that takes a kind of courage that most people never cultivate, because it requires you to say no, not just to others, but to yourself, to the part of yourself that wants to avoid pain, that wants to numb out, that wants to indulge in the temporary pleasures of distraction, instead of doing the difficult work of becoming who you could be. People ask me, how do I find my purpose? And the answer is often simpler than they want to hear. Stop running from responsibility. Pick up the heaviest thing you can carry and walk with it. That's where meaning is found, not in comfort, but in commitment. And you can't commit to anything unless you learn to focus. And you can't focus unless you're willing to deny yourself the comfort of easy distraction. We're told that multitasking is a virtue, that keeping up with everything, being everywhere, knowing everything all the time, is somehow the mark of a productive human being. But that's a lie. The truth is, divided attention leads to divided lives. You cannot build anything meaningful when your attention is fragmented. You can't develop depth in your character if you're constantly surfing the surface of life. Real change, real growth, it requires singularity of purpose, a sustained, disciplined focus on what matters most, even when it's not exciting, even when no one else understands. And here's the thing, this isn't just about personal success, it's about your capacity to contribute to the world. A distracted person is not reliable. A distracted person is not trustworthy. A distracted person cannot lead, cannot protect, cannot provide, because their mind is not anchored and their energy is being spent on illusion. But a disciplined person, one who has trained their focus, sharpened their awareness, resisted the siren call of meaningless stimulation, that person becomes a force of stability in a chaotic world. You want to know who will rise? The one who stops negotiating with weakness, the one who doesn't wait to feel motivated, the one who doesn't need a crowd to validate their effort. That person will rise, because they understand that discipline is not a punishment, but a path to self-respect, a path to strength, a path to meaning. You don't have to be the smartest, or the strongest, or the most gifted, but if you are the most disciplined, if you are the one who shows up consistently, who chooses the hard path over the easy one, who invests in the slow, painful process of mastery, then you will surpass those who waste their gift. You will rise not because you were lucky, but because you were intentional. And so the question becomes, when the distractions are screaming and the world is sleeping, will you rise? Will you shut out the noise and do what matters? Will you put your phone down, turn the lights on, and get to work on something that will make your future self proud, not because it's convenient, not because it's trending, but because you've decided that your life is worth more than comfort? That's what discipline is. The decision to suffer today for the sake of something greater tomorrow. The choice to forge a future that reflects your highest potential, not your laziest habits. And every time you choose discipline over distraction, you cast a vote for the person you want to become.
When the world sleeps, there's something remarkable that happens. Something you can't always see, but you can feel it if you're paying attention. It's not just that the streets are quiet or that the lights are dimmed. No, it's a kind of stillness that descends over everything. The chaos fades, the noise settles, and in that silence, a space opens up, a space most people waste, but not you, not if you're willing to listen, not if you're willing to grow. You see, silence is not just the absence of noise, it is the presence of clarity, and clarity is rare in a world so obsessed with stimulation. Most people flee silence because it forces them to face themselves. It strips away the distractions they used to avoid their inner dialogue. The scrolling, the music, the endless chatter, all of it is an escape. But if you can endure silence, if you can dwell in it rather than run from it, you'll begin to notice something. Growth doesn't scream, it whispers, and you can't hear it until everything else quiets down. Most people never change, not because they're incapable, but because they never stop long enough to understand where they are. They stay so busy, so loud, so frantic, that they never confront the gap between what they are and what they could be. Silence is where that confrontation happens. It's where honesty begins. And let me tell you, honesty is dangerous. It dismantles your excuses. It reveals your contradictions. It shows you all the ways in which you've betrayed your potential. But in doing that, it also offers you the raw material for transformation. That's why silence matters. That's why those early hours, those late nights, those in-between moments when the world is asleep, they're not just free time, they're sacred time. They are your chance to recalibrate, to reframe your vision, to build something deeper than reaction. That's where identity is forged, not in the presence of applause, but in the absence of it. Not when you're surrounded by people cheering for you, but when there's no one around to care whether you show up or not, and you show up anyway. In silence, you learn to listen, not just to your thoughts, but to your conscience. And your conscience is no small thing. It's not just a set of rules. It's the part of you that points upward, that demands more. It's the voice that says, you were made for something better than this, better than compromise, better than cowardice, better than comfort. But you can't hear that voice when you're buried in noise. You need the quiet. You need the space. You need the stillness to remember who you are and who you're meant to become. That's the tragedy of modern life. People have lost the ability to be alone with themselves. They associate stillness with boredom, silence with insignificance. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is that silence is the forge of greatness. It's where you confront the demons you've tried to hide, the wounds you've left unhealed, the dreams you've abandoned. And if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to walk through that valley with your eyes open, then what's on the other side is strength, real strength, not bravado, not arrogance, strength of character, the kind that's been tested, the kind that can withstand pressure. Growth is not accidental. It's not something that happens just because time passes. People confuse aging with maturing. They're not the same. You don't mature just by growing older. You mature by growing inward, by reflecting, by taking responsibility, by choosing to evolve rather than remain. And that process is deeply uncomfortable. It requires silence. It requires solitude. It requires that you stop numbing yourself long enough to ask, what am I doing with this life I've been given? And that's not a casual question. That's a soul-wrenching demand. Because once you ask it, you have to live differently. You have to admit that some of your habits are destroying you. You have to accept that your potential isn't being met, and worse, that it's your fault. But here's the miracle of it all. If it's your fault, then it's also in your control. That's the terrifying beauty of responsibility. It condemns your excuses, but it also empowers your future. You can change, you can grow, you can rise, but not if you stay buried in noise, not if you refuse the silence, because silence is where strategy lives. It's where vision is clarified. It's where you stop reacting and start planning. It's the moment when you put down the endless distractions and pick up the burden of self-development. And yes, it's heavy. Of course it's heavy. But you were made to carry, and better to carry something meaningful than to drift in aimless comfort. There's a reason that some of the most profound transformations in life happen in seasons of isolation. Not because isolation is inherently good, but because it removes the clutter. It strips life down to its essential. And in that stripped down state, you find out who you really are. Are you someone who needs an audience to perform? Or are you someone who will work in the dark, in the quiet, while no one watches? Because that's what rising looks like. It's not grand. It's not glamorous. It's disciplined. It's done in silence. You want to build something that lasts, then build it in private. Build it in the early hours. Build it when the phone is off, when the house is still, when the world is sleeping. Use that silence, not as an escape,
but as a workshop. That's where your skills sharpen. That's where your mind clears. That's where your identity strengthens. If you're waiting for the world to give you permission, you'll never start. If you're waiting for ideal circumstances, you'll never grow. But if you can find the courage to embrace the silence, to step into it, to let it teach you, to let it test you, then you will be ready for what comes next. Not just emotionally, not just intellectually, but spiritually. And that matters, because life will test you. And when it does, all the noise in the world won't save you. Only your inner clarity will. So when the world sleeps, when its noise fades, when its attention turns away, when its distractions go quiet, don't waste that moment. That's your moment to reflect, to realign, to grow. You don't get the future you want by wishing for it. You get it by sacrificing for it, by willingly giving up what's comfortable now, so that something better can exist later. That's the price of a meaningful life. And most people, frankly, aren't willing to pay, not because they can't, but because they haven't learned to delay gratification. They haven't learned that sacrifice isn't loss, it's investment. It's the oldest, most fundamental truth embedded deep within our moral structure. That to get something of value tomorrow, you must surrender something today. This idea isn't new, it's ancient. It's at the heart of every great story, every enduring tradition. The act of trading what is immediately desirable for what is ultimately meaningful. But today, that idea is slipping through our fingers. We're drowning in a culture that promises instant reward with no cost, pleasure without effort, reward without discipline. And it's killing people. It's killing their potential. Because the reality is, you can't have a meaningful life and avoid sacrifice. It's not possible. Every moment you spend on one thing is a moment you can't spend on another. So whether you recognize it or not, you're always sacrificing. The only question is, are you sacrificing the future for the present, or the present for the future? That's the question you have to answer if you're serious about rising while the world sleeps. Because while others are indulging, scrolling, procrastinating, you're choosing to pay now, to sweat now, to think deeply now, to learn, to build, to suffer, if necessary. Not because you enjoy it, but because you've glimpsed a future that's worth the price. You understand that anything truly valuable requires pain, requires trade, requires discipline. You cannot reap what you haven't sown, and no one else can sow it for you. The problem is that most people look at sacrifice as punishment. They think, why should I suffer when others are having fun? And that's a childish mindset. It's rooted in short-term thinking, because if you extend that logic, what does it produce? Shallow lives, weak men, aimless women, entire generations built on comfort instead of courage, and eventually, the bill comes due. The future shows up, and it's hollow, it's unstable, it collapses under the weight of its own neglected foundations. That's the cost of a life built without sacrifice. But if you flip the frame, if you begin to see sacrifice not as loss, but as a sacred act of shaping what's ahead, then everything changes. Then staying up late to study, getting up early to train, working when no one notices, it's not a chore, it's a declaration. It says, I'm not here just to consume, I'm here to contribute. I'm not just floating through life, I'm building something. I'm aiming upward. And that aim, it justifies the suffering. It redeems the struggle. We are meaning-driven beings, and meaning is found where responsibility lives. But responsibility always demands sacrifice. That's why so many people avoid it. They don't want the pain of being accountable. But you cannot develop strength in the absence of weight. That's true in the gym, and it's true in life. You need resistance. You need pressure. You need something that requires more of you than you currently are, because that's how you become more. And every act of sacrifice in that direction is an act of growth. People tell themselves, I'll enjoy life now and figure it out later. But later is built on what you do now. The future doesn't arrive out of nowhere. It emerges from your action. And if you're filling your life with low-value habits, meaningless distractions, and temporary reliefs, You're sacrificing your strength for sedation. You're mortgaging your potential for comfort. That's not wisdom. That's self-deception. There's a deep psychological truth in this. When you make sacrifices towards something meaningful, your life becomes ordered. Your suffering has context. Your effort has structure. And that structure gives you stability. It gives you dignity. It tells you what I'm doing matters. I'm orienting myself toward the good, even if it hurts. That is the difference between someone who is merely surviving and someone who is becoming. One lives reactively, the other lives sacrificially. And it's not always obvious, this kind of sacrifice. Sometimes it's not about dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's simply choosing to shut off the screen and read a book, to cook instead of ordering junk, to listen instead of speak, to put away a little money instead of spending it all. These are small decisions, but they're cumulative. Over time, they form the bedrock of a life that can bear real weight. And when you look around and see the chaos in people's lives, you can usually trace it back to a failure of sacrifice, a failure to do the hard thing when the hard thing needed to be done. So if you want to live with purpose, if you want to rise while the world sleeps, you have to ask yourself, what am I willing to give up? Because you can't have it all. That's the illusion. You can't binge Netflix, stay out late, waste time on social media, avoid every hard conversation, and expect to build something extraordinary. You have to choose. You have to burn away the unnecessary to reveal the essential. That's what sacrifice does. It clarifies. It forces you to focus on what matters most. And don't expect applause. People won't understand. They'll mock you, envy you, question you. But that's fine. That's part of the cost. You're not living for their approval. You're living for alignment with truth, with meaning, with purpose. And that kind of alignment requires solitude. It requires resistance. It requires sacrifice. But the fruit of it, oh, it's unmatched. It's not just success. It's peace. It's confidence. It's the kind of character that can face life with integrity, no matter what comes. You have to be the kind of person who can stand in a quiet room while everyone else is asleep and say, I'm working, not because I have to, but because I believe in the future I'm building. That's not a trivial act. That's the act that changes everything. Because the people who make those choices consistently, the people who discipline themselves to sacrifice what is easy for what is right, they become the anchors in a drifting culture. They become the leaders, the protectors, the builders. And here's the most powerful part. Your sacrifice doesn't just transform your life, it creates a legacy. It changes the trajectory of those who come after you. Because when you rise, others take notice. When you choose to suffer for something greater, you give people permission to do the same. That's how families change. That's how communities rise. That's how the world is transformed. Not by noise, not by outrage, but by individuals, quietly, courageously, sacrificing for what is good and true. So when the world sleeps, when it turns inward, when it seeks the path of least resistance, you take the path of highest purpose, and you take it with resolve, with discipline, with sacrifice.